Welcome, everyone, to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts' 2025 Donald Friary Symposium. I'm Bob Allison, president of the Colonial Society. The Colonial Society was founded in the 1890s to preserve and perpetuate the historical legacy of early America. The name Massachusetts is kind of a misnomer. We do cover all of vast early America, even before vast early America was a thing. But the ambitious founders of the Colonial Society imagined every state would have its own colonial society, so Massachusetts is just to differentiate us from the 49 others. And Donald Friary was president of the Colonial Society for 14 years after a long, distinguished career encouraging scholars and perpetuating public history at historic Deerfield. There are many, many Friary Deerfield alumni who are engaged in public history in various ways around the country, and we're all grateful to him for that. And the Colonial Society is deeply grateful to Don Friary for his leadership of the Society for 14 years. And on his retirement, we thought an appropriate way to commemorate his legacy here was to have annually a scholarly talk of some kind, and the scholarly talk turned into a conversation among scholars about a topic of interest to us as well as to Don and to the broader community. So this is meant to do that. So thank you, Don. Don is here with us. And tonight we actually have a very interesting, distinguished group talking about archives and revolution. The whole idea was Karin Wulf. And actually Karin is Don has deep ties to Providence and to Brown University. So it's very appropriate that Karin Wulf, who is the Beatrice and Julio Mario Santo Domingo director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library, be our moderator. And she pulled the panel together. So my role will end once I have introduced them. And Karin, as you probably know, coined the term vast early America. And she has both publications in book form as well as online. So Vast Early America is one. Time Magazine's Made by History is another to which she's contributed. The Scholarly Kitchen is another. Her first book was on women of colonial Philadelphia. And in June, her book Lineage, Genealogy and the Politics of Connections in 18th Century British America will be appearing. And amongst all of her other duties, Karin volunteered to pull this panel together. And joining her, to her immediate right, is Paul Erickson, who is the Randolph G. Adams director of the William L. Clements Library, where he's been since 2020. Previously, he was at the American Antiquarian Society, where he was... Is that right? Yeah. He was the director of academic programs there for 9 years, which is how many of us first got to know him. He's a native of Minnesota. He went to the University of Chicago and then did graduate work in Texas before venturing to New England and then back to the Midwest, where he now is at the William Clements Library. He was elected to membership of this organization in 2016. He's actually the most senior of the scholars here and membership of the Colonial Society. Take that, Beatrice. And Scott Casper, in 2020, was elected the 8th president of the American Antiquarian Society. Imagine that in 205 years at that time, they'd only had 7 presidents. So we anticipate that you will be there until 2040 or so at least, I think. Yeah, so, yeah. And before going to the AAS, actually returning to the AAS, he had a fellowship there in about 30 years earlier. He was a professor of history as well as the dean of the College of the Arts and Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland, and was the foundation professor of history at the University of Nevada in Reno. And he is the editor, co-editor, author, co-author of 9 books, including Sarah Johnson's Mount Vernon, The Forgotten History of an American Shrine, as well as Constructing Lives, Biography and Culture in 19th Century America, a volume in the history of the book series, as well as others, which if we mentioned would require us to go well into the evening. So I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank all of you for joining us for the 2025 Donald Friary Symposium on Archives and Revolution. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks. Thank you, Bob. Well, I think I set this up.
I'll set this up. Okay. So the setup is that I think we casually agreed that Scott would start because the AAS is the oldest of the societies or libraries represented here. But I'll just say that we've had a very quick conversation about how we wanted to briefly present some remarks about the libraries that we represent and about our thinking about how our collections enter into the conversations around 2026 and the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States from three quite different but really complementary institutions. So we'll each have something to say, and then I think we will chat among ourselves, and then we shall chat with you. Yep. Sound good? Okay. Scott.
All right. The American Antiquarian Society was founded as an archive of revolution. Isaiah Thomas, its founder in 1812, had been a patriot printer before and during the Revolutionary War. His departure from Boston, where his printing press was under threat from the royal authorities. This is sort of our origin story at the American Antiquarian Society. And my colleague, Ashley Cataldo, who's here tonight, who's our curator of manuscripts, knows more about Isaiah's press than anybody else I know. But in some ways, his flight from Boston to Worcester is our origin story. It's also the origin story of printing in Worcester itself. He came to Worcester, well, his press came to Worcester on the eve of the battles of Lexington and Concord. He stayed because he wanted to get the story. He was a newspaper man, so he wanted to get the story. He stayed and came to Worcester following his press after the battles of Lexington and Concord, where he wrote up his story and published it in the first issue of his newspaper, the Massachusetts Spy, to be published in Worcester. He had been publishing in Boston for several years, and at the bottom of that issue, he wrote, "This newspaper is the first thing ever printed in Worcester." And we have facsimiles of this for you tonight, so please take away a facsimile of this. Thomas's publishing operation, including his partnerships with many other New England printer publishers, was one of the two largest publishing operations in the United States in the roughly 2 decades after the American Revolution, the other being Matthew Carey's in Philadelphia. Thomas was also collecting books by this point, in books of what would become the United States. For example, in September 1791, he buys from Thaddeus Harris a printing of the 1663 Algonquian Bible, the Bible that used to be known as the Eliot Bible. At the turn of the 19th century, he turns his business over to his son, Isaiah Jr., in order to focus on his historical project, which is writing the history of printing in America, from the colonial period to the then present, roughly 1800. As another of my colleagues at AAS, John Garcia, has explained in a talk last month, shameless plug, it's available on YouTube, John explained that Thomas was interested in the history of printing not just in what became the United States, but in fact beyond the boundaries of the United States, including in Spanish America. And John has looked at his manuscript and annotations in our manuscripts and archives and found that Thomas's own annotations, his own copy, shows his interest in printing in Latin America, printing in Europe, printing in Asia and elsewhere, much of which was largely excised in the modern edition. To accomplish his goal of writing the history of printing in America, Thomas collected as much as he could of that printed record, including information about the printers and their presses. And the fruit of that project was not just his 2-volume History of Printing in America, published in 1810, it was also that collection of books and pamphlets and sermons and tracts and magazines and newspapers and dictionaries, which became the nucleus of AAS's collection, and much of which remains at AAS to this day. Thomas gave what he described as 9/10 of his library to AAS at its founding in 1812. He estimated the value of that in 1812 as $5,000, but he gave AAS, he didn't pay, I don't know why he said at a discount it would be $4,000, but he writes that.
It was a bargain sale, Scott.
And he gave this to AAS in 1812. He gave most of the rest to us in 1821, and he cataloged those materials. AAS's longtime librarian and president Marcus McCorrison, who retired in 1992, after his retirement, annotated Thomas's catalog with reference to the various bibliographies that include those works. McCorrison's catalog enumerates 2,633 distinct titles, many of them multi-volume works or runs of newspapers and magazines. So multiply that 2,633 by multiple volumes, and you get a sense of how large Thomas's collection was. Interestingly, to me at least, Thomas called everything published before 1700 ancient books and everything since 1700 modern books. I find that interesting because today at AAS, we call everything up to 1820 dated books, and since 1821 modern books. Books, pamphlets, and sermons printed by Thomas and his partners numbered more than 500 of the titles. And that doesn't even count his own newspaper, the Massachusetts Spy. Thomas envisioned his collection as essential source material for the study of what would become the United States. Its politics, its society, its thought. For 1812, it was a stunningly national collection, particularly in the newspapers and almanacs. In fact, his vision was even broader. He wrote in 1813 that he wanted AAS to collect material, quote, early printed either in South or North America, as well as what he called specimens with written accounts respecting them of fossils, handicrafts of the Aborigines, etc. AAS's subsequent development entailed both expansion and contraction. Many of Thomas's ancient books, those books published before 1700 in Europe, long ago were transferred to other institutions. We don't have a lot of those anymore. We pulled back from collecting South American materials. Hooray for the JCB. Though across the 20th century and into the 21st, we've expanded our Caribbean collections, which are a very strong part of our collections. We also deaccessioned most of the indigenous American material artifacts around the turn of the 20th century, which is a history that Kristen Mucher and Christine DeLucia have written about. However, we've continued to collect and preserve indigenous written and published texts in multiple indigenous languages. Indeed, of course, AAS has expanded Thomas's collection many times over in 213 years. Now it's about 4.5 million objects with a chronological scope that we'd recently formally extended from 1876 to 1900. But it's fair to say that Thomas's own contributions, notably the newspapers, which were microfilmed by Redex and later digitized, remain the origin point for key studies of the Revolution even today. I think, for example, of Joe Edelman's Revolutionary Networks. I also think of Robert Parkinson's Common Cause, which is a groundbreaking work that's built primarily on intensive reading of those newspapers. Thomas founded AAS when others were founding historical societies. Obviously, Mass Historical, 1791, New York Historical in 1804. What set AAS apart was, to some degree, its nationwide ambition, although recent studies have reminded us that the Mass Historical and the New York Historical also thought nationwide at the time. But even more, I think what sets AAS apart is this foundational collection that Thomas bequeathed to us, which established the Catholic collecting policies and practices we've been following ever since. So to answer your other question, what is AAS doing in this 250th moment? Programming. Our 250th programming, I would say, began in 2019-2020 with our exhibition, Paul Revere, Beyond Midnight, Paul Revere. We don't have exhibition space at AAS. Those of you who've been to AAS know that. So we have worked with other institutions to mount exhibits. That exhibit began at the New York Historical Society. It was going to go to Crystal Bridges in Arkansas, and then something called a pandemic happened, and it ended up being at the Concord Museum and the Worcester Art Museum for the latter part of its run. But that was really the beginning of our 250th work. With the advent of hybrid and virtual programming, we've more than tripled our programming since 2021, including many that speak to the 250th. We're not feeling like we need to be all about 2026. We're thinking about connections between our collections and the various anniversaries that are occurring over this period. So we did a series of programs in 2023 connected to the 250th anniversary of Phyllis Wheatley's publication of poems on various subjects, religious and moral. We'll host more such individual programs over the coming year. We're also thinking, given the scope of our collection, of doing some programs related to 1826 and 1876, as well as 1776, because the collections really do span the 19th century. Our own anniversary, so to speak, occurred last month, which was the 250th anniversary of Isaiah bringing his press from Boston to Worcester. And we figured that's our chance to do the AAS 250. So we hosted a symposium on new insights on Isaiah Thomas, a scholarly symposium. All the talks are now accessible, available on our YouTube channel. It features 8 scholars who are doing or have done new research on Thomas and his work, including, for example, John Garcia's work on the unpublished history of printing. And then the next day, we did a community open house in Worcester. We are, if not the oldest, one of the oldest cultural institutions in Worcester, and you might or might not be stunned how many people tell me, oh, I've never been inside, or I don't know what goes on in that building. So we did a community open house, got a lot of good press in advance, and 569 people showed up at AAS on a Saturday when it snowed 4 inches in the morning, on April 12th. And we had a working replica of Isaiah Thomas's press that had been brought out on a truck from Utah. So little kids as well as adults were working the press. We had a petting zoo of newspapers. We had lots of activities for people of all ages. It was a lot of fun. We also, and this is where I'll stop, but I have some other stuff when we get into the conversation. We aim to create some projects with lasting relevance beyond this year and next, notably with the support of our member Jeffrey Griffith, who's also a Colonial Society member. We will be digitizing for open access our U.S. Revolution manuscript collection. Numbers some 1,400 documents, roughly 8,000 pages of manuscripts related to the Revolution, everything from town petitions to loyalist confiscations to correspondence between officers and between enlisted men. It's a remarkable array of materials that we'll be digitizing over the next year to year and a half. And we hope also after that to create apparatus and materials, for example, for K-12 teachers. So that's a bit of what we're doing. It's exciting to think about it, and it's exciting to think about what could be next, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Nice. Thank you. So this is so much fun. It's, I suppose, indicative. The JCB and Brown are serving as local arrangement hosts for the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic in July. We're super excited to have everybody come to Providence. As chair of local arrangements, I was asked to think about what kinds of tours we would have. I learned some things from my younger colleagues, like I didn't even know that like the speakeasy was a thing now. And like, anyway, obviously a lot of learning has happened. But the primary tour that we're going to do for Sheer is a library crawl, because Providence has so many great libraries. So Providence Public Library is a glorious building with a fantastic collection of whaling logs and actually an incredible collection documenting tattoo artists from the 19th and 20th century. We're going to be going to Rhode Island Historical Society. We're going to be going to the John Hay Library, the Providence Athenaeum, and of course the JCB. And that's just kind of the start. So you can see that my enthusiasm for libraries and the potential of libraries runs very deep. So it is very fun to be here talking about libraries, library collections, and their possibilities, which clearly I will do at any opportunity. So I think, just super quickly about the JCB, and then I want to talk about what I think about the opportunities of 2026. The JCB, the John Carter Brown Library, was founded so many years after AAS. It was the private library of John Carter Brown. who was one of the brothers of the merchant Brown family in Providence. He had a great deal of wealth at the time, comparatively, and he did what some people do, which is he turned to collecting. And his collecting interest, beginning in earnest in 1846, and we say that because we have a kind of birth certificate of the library insofar as his first real invoices from booksellers in London and then on the continent are dated in 1846. He begins collecting Americana, which was an emerging interest, a kind of interest in not just seeing the foundations of knowledge in Europe, but seeing foundations of knowledge and information and historical importance in the Americas, North and South, including the Caribbean. And it is so interesting to think of him sitting at a desk at a table that we still have in the library and cranking open these crates that had come across on these ships and unloading these books and ticking off the invoices at the very moment when the Providence Gazette is also announcing that the U.S. is going to war with Mexico. And he is, opening these crates of things that have extraordinary materials. I always say that a quick shorthand for the JCB is to say that we have an extraordinary collection of printed materials, really an invaluable collection. We have we have all of the classics of 17th century New England at the JCB, but we have just as robust a collection of materials printed in 17th century Lima and in 17th century Mexico City. And we have just as robust a collection documenting the Haitian Revolution, which is one of the strongest collections in North America, as we do the American Revolution. So the JCB was, from the beginning, a collection that was meant to be about Americana, this particular kind of perspective. The library opened in 1904 in its present building, which is on the campus at Brown University. One interesting thing I think we might talk about a little bit is the different orientation of our institutions. The JCB is an independent research library, like the AAS, but we are on the campus of a university, and we have a really lovely and close relationship with the university. I'm a faculty member at the university. The president chairs our board. It's a pretty close relationship, but we are nonetheless independently financed and governed, whereas, of course, the Clements is an institution of the University of Michigan. So that difference is interesting. So the JCB thinks about questions, I think it's fair to say, about its own origin story on a regular basis. We're also a much smaller library than the AAS or than the Clements. I always say our library is all wheat, no chaff, but it is...
All killer, no filler.
Absolutely. But also it means that there are like projects that we could do at the JCB that it would be really difficult to do if you have a really enormous collection or even a mid-sized collection. So we've committed to digitizing the entire collection within 10 years, for example. We're already at about 28% of the library, just as an example. Okay, so opportunities of 2026. I think 2026 was always going to land awkwardly, given the relationship of Americans to the past that is a complex one, let's just say. At the same time, I think one thing that is still true now that was true 5 or even a dozen years ago when many of us were thinking about 2026 is that we have this incredible legacy, not just of 2026 to build on, but of 1976. The legacy of the bicentennial, in particular, for the volume of scholarly support and of support for developing resources out of library collections is remarkable, and I think it's worth our thinking about as we face the 250th. I think about, for example, the series of conferences and then volumes of essays created under the auspices of the Capitol Historical Society, but funded by Congress by a wily legislator, edited by my predecessor at my previous job, the historian Ron Hoffman. These volumes included one about women in the American Revolution, religion in the Revolution, diplomacy in the Revolution, slavery and freedom, which Ron co-edited with Ira Berlin. More than 10 volumes. They included work, each of them, from some of the most advanced scholars, and they meant to stand as a gift to the nation of the kinds of historical work that it would inform generations, and I think it has. An even more long-standing commitment to source materials garnered even more funding and an incredible legacy, and that is that beginning in the 1960s, public and private entities were investing in documentary editing, seeing the transcription and publication of particular types of materials as an essential part of how we get to grips with the history of the American Revolution. And I'm sorry for those of you who have heard me quote this particular anecdote because I'm doing it all the time now. It's like a total favorite. But anyway, on July 4th of 1963, President John Kennedy wrote the following, poignant, of course, because it's just a few months before he was killed. Quote, "Primary sources constitute the backbone of written history, and history is the means by which a nation repossesses its past. As the bicentennial of our own Declaration of Independence draws near," I love that, it's 1963, draws near, "it's all the more important to publish as completely as possible the original papers essential to a full understanding of our nation." This was written as the foreword to the first of what would be a dozen, and now, happily again, although who knows, ongoing volumes of the naval documents of the American Revolution published by the U.S. Department of the Navy. This opportunity to bring collections into public access and conversations is so important, and I think it's a mutual commitment that we all share with many of our colleagues and many of you in the room. For the JCB, one focus area for us, we have a kind of three-stream area of focus for 2026, and one is on hemispheric revolutions, naturally, given what I've told you about our collections. But one is on a theme that I know is also mutually important, which is what we're calling foundations of historical knowledge, and specifically how libraries and archives contribute to making history. Through our collections, our interpretive processes, including, of course, access work like cataloging and digitization, but also how we support research, which all three of our libraries do, namely through fellowships. In all of these activities, libraries and archives are making history. A lot of our programming is informed by critical archive studies, the theoretical work that undertaken by archivists and librarians, as well as disciplinary scholars to illustrate the importance of the interpretive work that's done within our institutions. So last summer, we co-hosted a conference, Archives of Revolution, joint with the McNeil Center, and we brought together disciplinary scholars, archivists and librarians like Ashley, who's going to get a call out. You're going to have to call out Ashley, too, because we're all doing it, just so you know.
I refuse.
Yeah. And public historians. So oppositional. And public historians to talk about specific archival collections from their vantage and how they differently illuminate the American Revolution. And, I think that that focus on Archives of Revolution, how we can think about the interpretive work that we're doing, I think it's going to be one of the first questions I ask to each of us. How is the interpretive work that we're doing? Yes, we're digitizing, but what are we digitizing, and what is the interpretive work undergirded that? So I'm also keen, and I just want to turn to my old-fashioned PowerPoint here, to a distinction that's, I think, of interest to me, and I think worth pointing out as we think about what are the archival materials that undergird our interpretive work on revolutions, which is the difference between archives and archives. That is, I think many of us, when we think about archives, we think about how we access collections, whether on the left, that's at the Newport Historical Society, and I love those upright drawers. They're so great. Those are town records. On the right, that's part of the Brown Family Business Records at the JCB, those beautiful archival boxes. And in the middle, that's some unprocessed material from the Judicial Supreme Archives here in Boston. But we think about how we access material in an institutional context. And that's obviously really important, and that's what we're talking about here. But there's another context that I think is worth thinking about, which is the question of how the people that we're talking about in the 18th century were themselves archivists and librarians, were collectors, were aggregators. Scott already alluded to Isaiah Thomas doing cataloging work of his collection. Here I've gathered, of course, in a nod to Paul, on the upper left, those are the trunks of the gauge papers with their wonderful little paper labels, which I'm sure he's going to talk about in a minute. On the upper right, that's from Stenton outside of Philadelphia, the James Logan House, with a wonderful label on the inside that says Wills and Papers of Sally Norris Dickinson. I gasped when I saw it. In the lower right, that's Ezra Stiles's. That's the trunk from his papers, which he actually inherited that trunk from a female ancestor. And the label on the top says Ezra Stiles's papers. In the middle is my favorite Lexington and Concord story, which is, I know there's a lot that happened, but my personal favorite, my actual favorite is Silas Deane, from the slippery politician from Connecticut, writing just a few days later to some friends and telling them that he knew everything that had happened. And by the way, Paul Revere was still missing and presumed slain. I love that. We have that letter at the JCB. But anyway, so my second favorite is Paul Revere. After he's gotten caught up, and then he gets released again. You all know the story. But his last act in Lexington is to go back to the tavern where John Hancock and Sam Adams had been hiding out, which is the reason, I guess, the British are marching out there, and to collect that trunk in the lower middle there. It's enormous. And they go back to collect it because it's got all these massive important, the papers of revolution, the actual archives of revolution. And they're like, oh my God, we can't let the British take that. So they're trying to get it across Lexington Green, and it's really big and heavy, and they're anyway, he complains about that quite bitterly, but it's in Worcester now. And then in the lower left is just one of George Washington's trunks that he had during the Revolution. Many different trunks made to hold his important papers and correspondence, and he was super fussy about his papers. Who would have them, who could touch them, who could organize them, who would fold them, and so on. So I think this point about how, yes, we are doing organizational work and we are thinking about interpretive work, but we're also actually inheriting some organizational, collecting, institutional interpretive work from the very period that we're interested in here. And with that.
Thanks, Karin. I'd like to thank Karin for organizing this, and Bob and the Colonial Society for the invitation, and thanks to Don for many years of wonderful leadership of the Society. It's really wonderful to be here. So I'm an accidental library director. I never thought I was going to wind up working at a library. I got my PhD in American Studies and really had no idea what I was going to do, frankly. But fellowships at libraries changed my life. And it was those fellowships that led me to wind up working at the Antiquarian Society for almost 10 years. And that also changed my life because I met my wife in the reading room of the Antiquarian Society. My son took his first steps in the Goddard Daniels house. So libraries and archives have shaped my life in pretty wonderful ways. So the William Clements Library was founded we opened in 1923 on the campus of the University of Michigan. William Clements, who we're named after, grew up in Ann Arbor. He attended the University of Michigan. He was the first engineering graduate of the university. And after he graduated, he went to work for a company called the Bay City Industrial Works, which, to do the Michigan thing, is here. The Bay City Industrial Works made big industrial machines that were mounted on rail cars, things like cranes and hoists and steam shovels. And the thing that made Mr. Clements very wealthy is that he got the contract to provide the steam shovels to dig the Panama Canal. So late 19th century industrialist, obviously a very wealthy man by the standards of his time, not J.P. Morgan rich, John D. Rockefeller rich, but a very wealthy man. He started collecting books in the late 1880s, early 1890s. He fell in with a group of book collectors in Bay City, and he developed a collection really modeled on the John Carter Brown Library with two main interests, European exploration of the Americas and the colonial period in North America. He was elected to the University of Michigan's Board of Regents, and our regents are publicly elected, which is an important institutional difference between us and some private universities. In 1921, he decided to donate his collection of about 20,000 books and maps to the university, along with money to build the building that we still occupy, which is at the heart of the central campus of the University of Michigan, right next door to the president's house. Soon to be vacant, in case anyone is looking for work. So I imagine in this room there are a lot of collectors, people who understand the collecting impulse. So when the library opened, Mr. Clements gave a speech where he said building this collection had been the great joy of his life, but he was done collecting. Right. So he went back home to Bay City, and his shelves were empty, and he was sad. And Henry Stevens, the great book agent who's helped build many collections, called him and said, you know, you haven't really collected manuscript material up to now, but there are some collections of family papers in England that might be of interest to you if you wanted to throw your hat in the ring. And so this is how the Clements became both an accidental archive and an accidental archive of revolution, because we had been a library before that point. We really had no archival collections until he embarked on this second phase of his collecting. And that phase of collecting was focused on materials related to the British side of the American Revolution. And he was able to acquire just absolutely spectacular manuscript collections. The papers of Thomas Gage and Henry Clinton, two of the British commanders-in-chief for North America, the start and the end of the Revolutionary War, papers of secretaries of state, prime ministers, just an absolutely incredible array of material, along with some American Revolutionary War figures as well, notably Nathaniel Greene and Anthony Wayne, but really a focus on the British side of the conflict. And that's the material that the Clements has become best known for. That's what gets cited most often in the scholarship. That's what gets used the most. So at this point, we have over 200 manuscript collections related to the American Revolution. And in many respects, those materials are the heart of the collection. That's what brings most people to the libraries, even now, even though we're working on digitizing materials, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So Mr. Clements didn't start out to build a revolutionary archive. He didn't set out to build an archive at all. It just kind of happened. And he was in the right place at the right time, but he was also very canny about working behind the scenes to make sure that he could get first in line for some collections that other people who had a lot more money than he did were interested in. So we get asked all the time how all this incredible stuff wound up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And it's a fascinating story. And people also ask, well, don't people in England want it back? And I'm sure they do, but they got some problems of their own to figure out on the cultural institution front before they start asking anybody else for anything back. So how does the opportunity of 2026 shape what we do? It may surprise you that some things actually happened in 1775. They've been in the news lately, so we've been taking 2025 as an opportunity. And I am also an antiquarian at heart, so I brought some handouts to show you what we're doing. So the main thing that we have been doing to prepare for these upcoming 250th anniversaries is to digitize the Thomas Gage papers. The scanning is almost done. It is one of our two largest manuscript collections. It's 100 shelf feet, over 100,000 items. We were lucky enough to get support from the National Endowment for the Humanities to do that. May it rest in peace. So, and we have started work on the Henry Clinton papers. So those two collections are our largest manuscript collections. Having them available digitally will transform the scholarship that people are able to do on the Revolutionary War. And because our revolutionary holdings are primarily manuscript instead of newspapers or printed, they help us tell a different kind of story. In particular, if you look at our exhibit that we have up now in Lexington and Concord called Bloody Work, it helps us tell a really moment-by-moment story in a way that you can't do with printed sources. So I'm sorry, I don't have enough copies of this, because this is a very long and cranky letter. It's 13 pages, so you can pass these around. This is a letter from the second Earl of Dartmouth to Thomas Gage. It was sent from London on January 27th, 1775. It did not arrive in Boston until April 16th of 1775. The second Earl of Dartmouth is mad. He particularly liked the part on page 4 where he says, I have already said in more than one letter that the authority of this kingdom must be supported. It's like, I have told you and told you and told you. You have an army at your disposal. You need to use it. We're not sending you 20,000 more soldiers. You need to get off your ass and get your army moving. But he says it very politely in an 18th century way over the course of 13 pages. So I'll pass these around.
13 pages.
So this letter arrives in Boston on April 16th. April 17th, Thomas Gage writes this draft of his order to Colonel Francis Smith. It starts halfway down this page. It's from his letter book, so the upper half is something else. So this is his draft of Colonel Smith to send troops to Lexington and Concord. And what's great about this is you can see Gage's thought process at work. He's editing, he's adding things, he provides the explanation for the expedition. That's April 17th. April 18th, this is the final copy of Gage's order to Colonel Smith.
Yep.
This is the letter that starts the American Revolution, telling Colonel Smith to take his troops to Lexington and Concord to capture the stores there. So just because of the types of archives that we have that tell this revolutionary story, we're able to tell the story of a familiar event, Lexington and Concord, in this incredibly granular way over the course of 3 days, April 16th, April 17th, and April 18th, which is something that you can't really do with printed sources, or you work in a different way. So when we think about our work as an archive of revolution and the way that our sources can be put to use, this is primarily the kind of work that we're hoping to enable, and that's why we're working to digitize the collections. Not just digitize them, but also write really robust, fantastic metadata so that people can find the stuff. Because we are on a large public university campus, supporting teaching is a huge part of what we do and how we think about the work that we're doing related to the 250th anniversaries. So we are working with faculty partners to build classes around our collections that will help them teach aspects of the history of the Revolution. We have a political science class that's going to be meeting at the Clements in the fall, focused on the 250th anniversary of Common Sense. We have, I think, 100 different editions of Common Sense, as well as many other works of Paine. And so that class will focus on Common Sense and the political theory that went into it. And then the students will curate an exhibit that will mount at the library. So that's part of our instructional mission at the University of Michigan. And we're also thinking about these anniversaries in the long term, right? I mean, because of where we are and because of our collections, I think there's going to be close to as much excitement about the Northwest Ordinance 250th anniversary as there is about 2025 and 2026. So we have a lot of years in front of us to think about the way that we can put our collections to use to support scholarship, to support teaching, to support public engagement. But it's it's all based on these core manuscript collections that kind of accidentally happen to wind up in Ann Arbor. Thanks.
So let me just start out with, I guess, a question for each of you. It's a really small question. We're all accidental librarians, it turns out up here. Although, did each of you also make little library cards for your books when you were a kid?
I did.
Yeah, okay. So 2 out of 3. All right.
Yeah.
So confessions of a wannabe librarian. So, there are obviously a lot of different kinds of organizations that are thinking about 250 and that have been planning and implementing 250 projects for some years in all kinds of different really creative ways. Public institutions, local governments, the national government, and also private organizations. One of my questions has always been, how do libraries and archives really best enter into that? Not just because what happens to us is people are interested in seeing copies of the Declaration, but it's harder to have these conversations about foundations of historical knowledge, how libraries make history, thinking about documenting the past and how it is that people in the 18th century were doing that too, and these kinds of things. What are our strategies for entering into these kinds of public conversations as libraries?
Well, when I talk about AAS, and Ashley, you may have been the one who asked me this at a staff meeting last week. What is your stump speech when you go out to talk about what AAS does? And a big part of that, before 5 months ago, was that preserving and making accessible the primary materials. And by making accessible, I mean everything from the metadata, which I, like Paul, I started as a fellow at AAS 35 years ago when there was still a card catalog. And in that card catalog at AAS, there were not just the kind of cards I would have seen at my university library, but something called half cards. You remember the half cards? The half cards that were created in the early 20th century by catalogers like Avis Clark, a name that's really important for AAS. Women were very involved in places like this, even though the presidents were only men. And so those half cards would lead to spaces in the stacks and all that sort of thing. And now, of course, we have so much digitized. Here's my point. When I talked about AAS before 5 months ago and how we do this, I talked about the importance of primary sources and their accessibility and maintenance and stewardship at a time when more and more can be faked. That when we're thinking about a world of AI, when we're thinking about a world where people talk about what's real, the work that we do in our libraries and archives is crucial for the preservation of the actual objects for future study by people who will ask questions that we never even imagined today. And so that was part of my, that was the core of it in many ways. In the last 3 or 4 months, I've added another piece to that, which is about the importance of doing this work when the federal support for it that we have become accustomed to over the last 50 years and more, the support for the Papers projects, the support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the support from IMLS and other organizations, when that is under siege or worse. And I think about the term independent research libraries. All of us are accidental librarians running something called independent research libraries. And when I started at AAS, several of us are part of an organization called the Independent Research Library Association. And it seemed as though what made us part of an association was the fact that all of us were not under the direct auspices of either a government or a university governance, even though several of them are on university campuses. Now it almost feels as though we're thinking about what we're independent from. And that what that allows us to do, I hope, which includes continuing to assert the importance of telling all the stories or making it possible for the people who use our libraries, students at Michigan and Brown, researchers and scholars at all 3 of our libraries, and so on, to have access to those sources that allow for stories that right now seem to be in the crosshairs of parts of our government. And I think that to me is a big part of what we have to do as we think about, you mentioned 1976. I'm going on too long, sorry. But you mentioned 1976, Karin. And I think that a lot of us, as we thought about 2026 a few years ago, thought about 2026 as a moment to do it differently from 1976.
Right. Yeah.
And I still do, even though that may not be where the discourse is going. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm thinking, I hope to only do, a little bit as well. This is what I'm thinking about, the production of scholarship and the production of scholarly resources that came out of the bicentennial. Amazing. Even if the national story was a cramped and blinkered one. Anyway, sorry.
So the question about engagement with different organizations and broader communities is one we think about all the time at the Clements. The Clements, when it opened, was very closed off as a research institution. It's fair to say that Mr. Clements and Randolph Adams, the first director, were very, very strict about who they let use the collections. And I was told when I started that that was the case in the building overall, that nobody was allowed in. One thing that we learned in doing research around our centennial 2 years ago is that that was not the case, that the Clements was actually kind of, as a space, was wildly open to the community in its early decades. It was open at night and on weekends. Local book clubs met there. Different groups from the community met there. A lot of K-12 education happened in the Clements. They just didn't have access to the stuff. So in a way, we're kind of trying to get back to that a little bit in terms of our community engagement. But I think it's important for us to, it's something I always try to keep in mind, that the Clements is on a university campus for a reason. It's not an accident that we're at the University of Michigan. And the University of Michigan, if you count students, faculty, and staff, is a 90,000 person organization. So when I think about community engagement, that's our first audience. We do events with alumni around the country, and I always ask people, how many of you went in this building when you were a student? Usually it's only a few hands. And then I ask how many have walked by it a million times and wondered what went on inside, and I see a lot of hands. So my first responsibility is to make sure that everybody who graduates from the University of Michigan and everybody who works there knows what it is, knows what we do, knows what we have, and are proud that it's on campus. And then I think we can think about, engaging more broadly in the community and around the state, but also being aware that if we can engage successfully with that audience on campus, we're already reaching into all of those different communities.
Yeah.
And so that's one important way that I think about connecting with communities. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that most members of the general public have no idea what the humanities are, and they absolutely have no idea what humanities research is. And they, people come for a tour of the library and they see people sitting at lovely tables reading books, and they think, oh, I'd like to read books. I can do this. And they don't see all the work that goes into being able to read those books or read those manuscripts in a way that will help them make sense. And so I think a big part of our job is to both model what humanities research looks like for people and to give, especially students, the experience of doing it so that they don't think that it's easy and that they don't think that humanities scholars are people who just make stuff up, which is what a lot of people think people in humanities do. And the other thing that I think is important is, everybody on our staff, no matter what they do, is engaged in a form of scholarly communication, whether they are writing catalog records, creating metadata, working with readers in the reading room. We are people's points of contact with the scholarly world. And so doing that work in a responsible and ethical and thorough way, even if it's not something that's published in a book or a magazine or a journal, that's scholarly communication, and that's a really important part of sort of how I think about the way that we engage with different communities.
So I think I'm going to ask you each one more question, but then I thought then we'll open it up for conversation here. So my question is, it's a softball, which is, what's your favorite, most enticing item that you've recently that you've engaged with at the library?
Recently?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't have to be recent.
Does it have to be about the revolution?
No, it
Okay.
could be anything.
What, can I pick two?
Yes,
Okay.
of course. We have no rules.
Okay, good. So one is a letter that we recently acquired, and apologies to Angela and Kyle because they heard me talk about this morning. We have the papers of Jeffrey Amherst at the Clements, but they're his official papers. So it's reports to his superiors. There's not family stuff in it. We were able to acquire a letter from his first wife, and it's written to him in the fall of 1758, in the midst of the 7 Years' War. And she's writing to him because she's gotten news of a victory that he has won. Her spelling is erratic. I don't think she was had a lot of formal education. and she writes to him and says, there's news of a piece, which I suppose is good, although I don't take much satisfaction of it on my account, because I imagine that if there is, you will be made governor of some island in the West Indies, and everyone will come home but you. Like, she is bitter about his success in a really powerful way. She's ill at this. She dies 2 years after this letter's written. Her husband's been overseas for years. She doesn't know if she's ever going to see him again. And it makes me think about the experience of families of people who are in our manuscript collections in a totally different way. So that's one thing that I really love. The other thing, it's not super new. We bought it. Maybe.
Is it going to lighten the mood? Just asking.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I'm not going to talk about post-mortem photography or anything. It's this. We bought it about 3 years ago. It's this tiny little notebook about this size that a group of boys in New York City made in 1869 called the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Disabled Hats. They were just having fun. They were messing around. This is a year after the ASPCA has been formed, so they're clearly modeled on that. And it is full of beautifully colored watercolor paintings of different kinds of hats that they saw people in New York City wearing, but they've given them all names that are clearly in-jokes making fun of their friends who maybe wore those kinds of hats, or they wore another hat that they thought looked stupid. They wrote a constitution, they elected officers, it's a whole thing, but it's all about like making fun of hats. And it's such a joy to get a chance to see people in the past just messing around.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite things we have.
That is awesome.
Why don't you take this
No, you
question?
go ahead. Oh, I will.
right.
You go ahead.
So I'll
I've
try-
got to. I'm
I'll do
going to be
two.
super quick. So
I'll do two. One that is maybe we had about 3 years. It's a newspaper that we acquired about 3 years ago called the Borax Miner. Borax was a mining town in Nevada that, as far as I lived in Nevada for 21 years. This is 1872, I believe. It's the only known issue of this paper still to exist. This is a kind of thing we do at AAS. And what I love about it is that not only did that newspaper, as far as we know, not exist past there, the town of Borax has not existed in Nevada for probably at least 100 years. The mining was done, the town ended. And so to me, that is a glimpse into a place and a set of experiences that we may know from no other source. The other is a collection that we acquired in the last several months. The Worcester County Sheriff's Office found in a storeroom its records from much of the 19th century. And somebody in the sheriff's office had the thought, these ought not to go in a dumpster. And they had the second thought, these could go to the American Antiquarian Society. They are everything from visitor logs to the records of who was brought in and arrested to minimuses, which were documents about particular cases. In many of these cases, providing windows not into the story, not just into the story of incarceration, but also to the lives of individuals who may not be recorded in any other sources. And so for us, as we think about telling otherwise untold histories of people who might not show up in other places, a collection like this is tremendously exciting, and I'm very excited to see what kinds of research can happen.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Oh, my favorite is always like the last thing I saw. So, I'm currently obsessing about the journals of Congress. I mean, literally, you all know how this is, right? You like go to a library and you're like, oh, wow, this thing. Anyway, I'm currently interested in the journals of Congress because I've always been interested in government documents, and I'm currently on a jag about how it's really been very important since the founding of this country that, accountability and transparency through the publication of government documents is really important, right? Anyway, I've loved doing little show and tells on that. But the early journals of Congress that are printed are so interesting. The ones from the Continental Congress from 74 and then 75, the May 10th of 1775, when they're first collecting these testimonies from Lexington and Concord. And there are like 10 guys that they ask, so what happened to you on that day? Tell us what happened. And there's one woman who says, I was in bed. I had had a baby a week before, and my house was surrounded, and they took my nightie off the line. Right. Anyway, so, okay. So Bob, thank you so much for having us. We would love to have a few minutes of conversation, if that's okay with you.
If you have a question or comment, please keep the microphone for the people watching on Zoom. And Anthony, can I ask you?
I love this so much. Oh, yeah, sure. Yep.
More things to take home.
More things to take home.
Exactly. This is amazing.
So raise your hand and identify yourself to Anthony so you can do
With AI technology being at the forefront with taking handwritten documents, FamilySearch.org has been doing that now with all of their 2.5 million microfilm, which has been digitized. The National Archives is doing that with essentially citizen archivists to do the pensions. Have either or of all three of you, has there been a public or a institutional effort for AI transcription or looking for volunteers to help transcribe, for instance, the papers that you have, especially the Revolutionary War?
Paul, you've done it.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about two things that we've done. One is a much later collection. We acquired the collection of photographs from a Michigan collector named David Tinder, who collected probably close to 150,000 photographs of Michigan by Michigan photographers over the course of his life. And a large part of that collection was a group of about 65,000 real photo postcards from all over Michigan from the early 20th century, 1900 to 1940s probably. Organized by county and then by town within each county. We were not going to individually catalog 65,000 real photo postcards. It was never going to happen. So what we did is we put them on a crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. We scanned them all in, they're all the same size, so they can go through the scanner pretty quickly, and asked people to tell us what was in the pictures. And we gave them sort of keywords to choose from. The AI engine behind the platform required there to be 7 descriptions of each picture. It would compare them, select the ones that had the most in common. People also had the opportunity to transcribe any writing that was on the back of the postcards. So we had 4,200 volunteers just stumble across this project online. They identified all 65,000 postcards. They transcribed 42,000 of them. A guy who we only know as Railroad Jim wrote 50,000 words about postcards with trains in them because he knows a lot about trains in Michigan. So that's one project that we've done that has kind of combined AI and crowdsourcing transcription. We have started testing a couple AI platforms on the gauge papers, which is nice because the gauge papers have lovely handwriting. And the experiments we've done is we've run it through one engine and then through a second, and when we run it through both, we get about 93% accuracy, which I think can go up as it learns over time. We haven't done a huge amount of material through it yet, but we're kind of still testing it out. We've tried some of the Henry Clinton papers on this as well. If you've ever looked at the Henry Clinton papers, handwriting not so great. The AI engine can't tell what language it's in. So that's going to, we're going to have to wait a while for the technology to catch up to that. So, yeah, I don't know what you've been doing.
Well, I mean, a variety of different things. I think we're interested in thinking about creating a small corpus of our OCR text for a kind of gated searches. But I guess I want to answer your question differently to say that I think a real looming problem for all of us is the integrity of the images that we've put out into the world. And as I said, the JCB has about 28% of our collection is already digitized. We've finally brought all of that material into a single platform. It was like a lot of places in a lot of siloed spots. We've got a single platform now. It's openly accessible. That's great. We think we can protect the integrity of what's on our platform. Of course, we can do nothing about what goes out into the world. Right. But I think the genuine question is about retaining this integrity of the scholarly record, both primary and secondary sources, and this is an enormous challenge for libraries and archives, but also for aggregators of scholarly content. And there's not an answer to that yet. I would like to think that the gate swings one way and it doesn't come back the other, but I know that's not true because I know that our library search engines are already training themselves on Google's adjusted search, and that's already bringing slop into our environment. So anyway, so that's the thing I think most about, is less the potentially more fun stuff and more the creepy stuff.
Yeah. We're thinking, we have not, I know Ashley has worked a little bit with some AI programs thinking about transcription of manuscripts, and you could talk about this better than I can. You've done kind of testing, like kind of beta testing on how this works and the accuracy rates and so on. I want to mention, picking up on Karen's point, we estimate that something like 30% of our collections have been digitized at this point, and most of that digitization, the largest part, has occurred over decades of work with commercial vendors, which is a different model, which worked well for a collection of our size, but that digitization happened over a period of 60 years going back to microforms. And what we know is that digitization, and much of the first round of digitization was digital images from microfilm and other microforms. The OCR is not very good. It doesn't, you don't pick up as much that way. The images are less sharp. So how will the platforms that we have used over time hold up over time? And that's a question that we're wrestling with. What would it take? And it would take more than we have to go back and reshoot millions of pages of images. And yet we know, for example, Freedom on the Move, a program or a project to digitize advertisements for people who were fleeing enslavement, has worked primarily from digitized newspapers, many of which were originally microfilmed. They came to AAS to look at the original newspapers and found that the OCR missed between 35 and 40% of the original ads. That's what we're dealing with. That's why having the original continuing to have these original sources matters. Yeah. But then you raise the question of who has the resources to come and use our places. And that's, digitization is fabulous at making things more accessible. The Gage papers, the Clinton papers, everything in the JCB. Yeah. And it goes back to the question of the integrity of that work and access to the work. Yeah.
Thank you for your insight.
I mean, I think one of the things to sort of name as we've thought about the long lead up to where we find ourselves now is a certain amount of trepidation among scholars about what the narrative or narratives could be. So, Kyle Roberts, Congregational Library. The discussions I have with my staff might be different, but I suspect they're akin. When you talk with your marketing director, are we celebrating or commemorating? And we've had a long road to kind of get to this, and we've had a very interesting several months, which have shifted things. What now that we're in the moment, what is the role that the archives could do? Because I am struck that we might be carrying a lot more public history weight than other institutions. The Museum of Fine Arts in 1976 put a massive exhibition on. I don't know if they're planning on doing that. I haven't seen any press releases about that. The Federal Commission for Funding, we haven't gotten a check yet. It's really fallen on the state. We were very lucky to get one of the MA 250 grants. 172 institutions applied, 37 were awarded. During the kind of webinar about applying for that, people were like, well, you only gave us 3 weeks to apply. Will those grants be here next year? And the response was, oh, well, the World Cup will be here next year and the tall ships, so we don't actually have to fund the revolution. We don't need the programming. So it's a two-part question. Are we celebrating? Are we commemorating? How do we help people understand that? Or are we just providing the primary sources that let other people decide? And is there a greater weight on our archives for doing this kind of public history work right now?
Well, I think my thought about this has always been that from an institutional perspective, we're always commemorating, not institutions. We're commemorating. Individual people feel differently about that across a wide spectrum. Like all of us who work, in organizations know that we've got folks who feel very differently about all kinds of things. They feel celebratory and they feel condemnatory and all kinds of things. But as an institution, we're commemorating. I do think that archives and libraries have a particular role to play now. I think we had it before. I think it's more obvious what we can do now. That is, that we can be more forward with the fact that we do hold materials. We hold materials that can be interpretive. We can teach people more, actually, and we can bring more people in to tell us about what we have and how they feel about what we have. That is, scholars, but also whether it's our campus communities or whether it's our local or regional or beyond. I think this point about people like libraries. Most people like libraries. Many people like libraries. All right, fine. I'm like the wrong person to be assessing this. But I do think that teaching and not teaching, maybe that's the wrong word, speaking to and communicating about what it is that we do rather than just the objects that we hold is quite important. Like process is as important as the item itself. So when we talk about a copy of the Declaration, we always talk about the fact of why it is that people are not wowed by this kind of beat-up piece of paper that's really unprepossessing, because that's what it was at the time, and about the process of government printing and government documents and accountability and how it's actually like the 9,000th declaration that Congress makes. It just happens to be that July one is a very big deal, but they're declaring stuff all the time. Anyway, so like the process pieces I think are really important for us.
I'd like to think that we're not doing either one. For everything that we do, whether it's instruction, exhibits, public programs, they're rooted in our collections. And our collections are not complete. They're wonderful, but they don't have the whole story. And so I think our job is to present the story that our collections help tell. And it's not celebrating, it's not really even commemorating. It's just saying this is what the records that we have say. This is what we think they mean, with an understanding that other people with different experiences from different perspectives may well think they mean something very different. And if people take those sources and what they say and do the work of commemoration on their own, that's great. But I don't think that that's our job necessarily.
I think I'm closer to Paul on this, although the word we have used when we have to choose a word is commemorate and not celebrate, because commemorate is linked to memory, which I think is at the core of what we seek to promote and preserve. And I think the other piece of that is that this is always plural. It's histories, it's memories. They add up maybe to a history, and yet there are so many stories to be told from these collections. And we too talk about how it starts from the collections. As an accidental librarian, I think that was the part that I had most to learn about coming into this job, about how it all starts from the collections.
Hi. One of our live stream viewers, Ira Stoll, has the question for you. How do you balance making newly digitized content free to all and open access on the internet versus licensing them to pricey database vendors that sell primarily to academic libraries?
Well, I'll just say that, so for the JCB, our materials have been consistently free to use and free and open to use. But in part, that's because of the timing and the nature of the collections that we have. I think I know for a fact that one of my predecessors, if we'd had a collection that we could market, but the AAS had already done it. Do you know what I mean? And he was like, rats, we couldn't say, you know.
But now that you know there's a 30% gap in what they've digitized,
Exactly.
there's your window.
Exactly. Better. But get that 30%, right, exactly. No, but so, you know, so maybe 12 years ago or so, the decision was taken to make the JCB's material, to really embrace open access. I've been on both sides of that argument in my career, thinking about why it was that open access for all scholarly content, for example, when I was at the Alejandro Institute, publishes a journal and books, that wasn't a practical approach because it costs so much to produce these materials, and it costs so much to digitize, and the sheer labor of the cataloging and the scanning and the metadata attachment and the processing and all of this stuff, it's very, very expensive. So what I'm saying is that the JCB has a commitment to free and open access to our materials, but it was a strategic decision made on a specific business model, and other business models and other strategies, you know, for the benefit of an organization would look different.
University of Michigan is a public university, so everything that we have digitized is freely available to the public. All of our printed material that we digitize goes into HathiTrust, so I realize that is not totally free. Some people, it does have a cost, but it's much less expensive than the big subscription databases. You know, that's not to say that if a digital vendor came to us and offered us $5 million to digitize our collection of the Police Gazette, that we wouldn't take it. But we'd have to do a lot of talking at the university to do that.
Yeah. Our model has been the other model for a long time. I would say that our goal over time is to move toward more open access, and the projects that we are doing now, primarily by applying for grants, are all open access projects. They are of necessity on a smaller scale than what the commercial vendors could do. So we're moving forward on a couple of tracks. One is these smaller scale projects, which can be several thousand pages. For example, the Revolutionary War manuscripts, 8,000 pages. We can get a grant to do that. 1 million pages would be a lot more challenging to get a grant given the cataloging that's required, the conservation that's required, and so on. The other piece is that the vendor model, that is you might call it the Redex model, the Gale model, and all the others, is a model typically that includes a limited exclusivity period for the vendor, after which the scans revert to the control of the institution itself. And what we're trying to figure out now is what is the next model that will allow us to make those scans, once they are in our control and out of that exclusivity, more open access. The labor of
It's not
involved
free.
It's not free. So how do we make that next move? That's
Yeah.
part of what we're working on now.
And I should say that the digital work that we're doing, we do in partnership with the main library at the university. So all of our digital collections are hosted on servers run by the main library. That's not work that we have to do. It's an advantage of being at a big institution.
Yeah. Do we have time for one last question? Yeah. Okay, great.
Thank you for a very thoughtful response to that, which is an important thing to me. I just retired from an institution that does charge for the use of its collections, and I've been asked this question many times, but I rarely hear from people who are willing to try and find support for institutions who are charging for their collections. And I think that that's an important part of this discussion. We need to support our institutions so we can continue to care for those collections so they are still there in 50, 75, 100 years.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like a great note on which to end. I think we all just want to thank Bob and Don, of course, and